All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanagh here. Technically, we turned 18 years old in February, so this is our 19th year. We're rocking and rolling. It's going to be 20 years next year. Hard to believe, but it's almost May in 2026. Hello, 2026. Wow. And I think it's going to be so much fun today. We're talking to two of my favorite people in the business, Mark Madsen of Third Nature and Sami Akbay of Dagen.ai, a new company doing agentic data pipelines. So, how do agentic data pipelines work? What are these things? We're going to find out. Very interesting stuff. We do have a presentation for if you're listening on the radio, hop onto YouTube and check it out. Look for how do agentic data pipelines work, and that should show up in your browser. Hopefully, you never know these days with these browsers. Google is a bit on its heels. Anthropic is rising. ChatGPT is wondering about things, and all kind of crazy stuff is happening. And as I think about it, I think about the evolution of data management and where we've been. What are these data pipelines? We went from ETL scripts to data pipelines, the modern data stack. Now we're at this agentic world. These are all inflection points. I think this one inflection point is probably the biggest that we've seen. Maybe the cloud was, it's hard to say. The cloud took about 10 years longer than I thought it would take to really take off. And even then, did it take off in an optimal fashion? No, I don't know. People were doing a lot of movement, huge forklifting efforts to get data into the cloud, and then some repatriating coming back out of the cloud. There's all kind of crazy stuff happening out there. But maybe to kick us off here, I'll just say what I think is happening, and I'll throw it over maybe to Sami and then to Mark to comment on. But when I look at the evolution, it often seems like innovations happen just in time. So if you think about the access patterns of agentic, well, they're going to blow away traditional access patterns for data. Like all these systems we've built were built primarily for human consumption as an analyst or as an operator to get the data you need. And pipelines break all the time. I mean, we've built some pipelines ourselves to try to connect different marketing systems to other production systems. They break constantly. And you're like, why is this breaking? Well, let's face it, things break. And in the world of federated systems, any touch point is a control point that can break. So this is one reason why things fall apart. And it's frustrating. And it's not fun to manually fix data pipelines. It's not fun to manually maintain gosh darn anything. It's cool to launch new programs. It's cool to launch new things. It's cool to when all the systems are humming, but it's not so cool when things break. So I think that this agentic stuff is coming just in the nick of time. I think the allure of these large language models is so powerful. I came up with a metaphor the other day. It reminds me a lot of the iPad back in the 2010s. Because if you think back in like 2010 or 2011, whenever the iPad came out, all these CEOs showed up to work with an iPad. And the IT department was, whoa, we're not going to support that. And the CEOs was, yes, you are, because I'm the CEO and that's just the way it's going to be. And people just had to build around that. BYOD. Remember the whole BYOD thing came around because of the iPad. And now it's bring your own model, right? BYOM. So IT is going to have to deal with this stuff, period. It must happen. It's time to get your data house in order for the age of AI. With that, Sami Akbay of Dagen, welcome to DM Radio. What's going on with you?
Hi, Eric. Great to be here. And hi, Mark. Good to see you. What's going on with me is that we are working on identifying the data pipelines, and everything is trying to move towards embracing AI. And people are very enthusiastic about building and building and building. And of course, when you build things, it's critical to have the matching underlying infrastructure so that we're making responsible use of the data that powers all these systems, efficient use of this data. And we're also creating a net positive value because,
Hmm.
yes, everything is possible, but to make those things possible with a positive value generation, you need to make sure that the infrastructure that powers all of this, and from our perspective, it's the data estate that powers this, needs to also kind of come to the modern era. The big thing that has changed, as you said, is that we built everything over the years for human consumption. We built, the system so that your reports and dashboards and eventually the self-service BI these were all for human analysts and human consumers. Increasingly, the consumers are changing, and those consumers are more and more the machines.
Hmm.
As we start having the machines use the underlying infrastructure, we're putting more stress on the systems that we built, especially data pipelines, and we're changing the rules a little bit, right? Like we designed things for a different kind of judgment, a different kind of era, whereas how things are optimized for AI, that's different, and
Hmm.
we're trying to address that.
Hmm. And so, big question. uh, there is, in the database world, you have this concept of impedance mismatch, right? Where the speed or the pace at which something is coming in does not align. And like in the world of gears, everything has to work properly. If some gear is off, like the whole thing breaks, basically. So how do you address what is essentially the sort of de facto impedance mismatch of old systems with agentic access patterns?
It's a little tricky because you know that is always going to be a challenge. But when you look at the modern data stack, people who have moved to the modern data stack, they have actually built something that is compatible with the agentic world more so than the preceding generation, right? So one thing that happened is that we kind of went two different ways to like store the data, right? We have the data lakes and the data warehouses.
Mhm.
Data lakes and data warehouses kind of diverged and then they start to converge a little bit. But it's now understood that enterprises need to have both data lakes and data warehouses, call it lake houses or lake bases or whatever the term du jour is. But operational data has to be brought to these centers of data gravity. And as we do this, the winning kind of model has become the medallion architecture, right? Let me just bring what is going on in my operational systems into a staging area, and then from there, use different transformation approaches, be it DBT or Spark or whatever else, to create a silver layer and a gold layer to represent that data. That is actually the gears of the modern data world and the shifts and the way that like the transmission, if you will, so that you can actually run your business at its own cadence and then bring that data to an analytical framework so that it could support a new world with a completely different cadence.
Mhm. Yeah, well, it's like the what the there are lots of different parts of the car. I'm thinking of the flywheel, right? Where in the middle you're kind of capturing the energy and it's allowing you to have disparity on either side, right? And so that's kind of the layer that you've got. It's almost like for a flywheel in a car. Is that too far out of metaphor, or what do you think, Sammy?
So here's the thing. You bring the data to a center of gravity, an analytical system, and after that, how you're going to use that power and what you're going to do with it, it has been pretty static in the past. We built systems and said, hey, bring data from Oracle, put it into Snowflake, or bring data from, I don't know, Salesforce and put it into BigQuery, right? And we did not really specify what we were going to use it for downstream. So the engine turns, you're generating power, and you're using some of that power to turn the wheels. You're also using some of that power to run the air conditioning, to run all these other auxiliary systems, right? And they have different purposes, different goals. If you're traveling down the highway at 90 miles an hour, uh, and if you have to prioritize or if you have to deal with some anomaly, you probably have a different priority for that powering that movement versus powering your AC, right?
Interesting.
And that what am I doing with that power thing is not built into my current pipelines, my static pipelines. With agentic data pipelines, one of the things that we're trying to do is build the intent of whatever operation I'm carrying out into that flow.
Mm.
So that would be analogous to my engine is turning, it's powering a lot of different things, but first and foremost, if I'm moving 90 miles an hour, uh, turning the wheels is my number one priority, right?
Hmm. That's interesting. I'll throw it over to Mark. We are definitely at an inflection point. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And there are responsible ways to move forward and less responsible ways to move forward. And then, of course, there's the decision to not move forward at all and just continue to live in the past. And I think we do need to move forward, but there are a lot of moving parts here, and it's a complex system. I've wondered for years, when is someone going to solve this data integration challenge where there's so much data being moved around? There's so much effort being put into fixing the data pipelines. It drives data engineers nuts. It's one reason why they leave these companies. But I don't know. What do you see, Mark?
The word you used was solve. How do we solve, these complex data issues? Well, there are thousands of different data issues. Which ones are you trying to solve, right? You're
Right.
being ambiguous, right? So
I
I
always do
have
that.
to infer your intent by taking those words and then
That's
breaking
right.
them down. And interestingly enough, that is exactly the sort of thing that today's type of popular model, the language model, which is not tuned to a particular domain or task, can't do. You prompt it, it generates output. You and I have a dialogue. And I say, well, what do you mean by that? Right? Because I sense a point of ambiguity, or I say something back to you. Well, the way I would solve it is, I would renominate the Franistans. And then you say, no, 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 I don't have a problem with my Franistans, right? Because I've made an assumption and an interpretation, right? The machine generates that output, but then, we've created a dynamic today of interacting with things as chatbots without building smarts into systems to deal with stuff. So when you said, I want to solve these data problems, it's like, well, we have multiple. Sami walked through several, right? He talked about the complexity of a data estate. He talked about the transitions from different sets of technologies, like the world of an enterprise data warehouse, which was a layered architecture which presumed modeling at the center based on knowledge of what information is being requested, but also knowledge of how it was being used, which in his terms on pipelines was intent, the user intent, of which there may be many. And that is one of the challenges of an enterprise data warehouse. So people throw all that out in favor of data lakes, forgetting that one of the reasons for that intent of different uses was so-called single version of the truth. There are times when numbers must reconcile, and three of us have to agree, right? And so how you solve that problem is different from how you solve the problem of I need to build an automated system that makes sure my car doesn't run into stuff or lock the occupants inside and catch fire, which is different from a real-time marketing system, right? Which is marketing pipelines. But there are tolerances around different categories of data pipeline for different purposes. And
Mhm.
so, as an architect, my job is to tease this stuff out and say, well, you're trying to build an automated system that does online scoring and classifying and blah, blah, blah. I'm going to do it differently than I need to build a quick Tableau dashboard to check out some stuff, which is different than this is, a sort of dashboard plus drill down and diagnostic environment for when things go wrong in this process, and 50 people use it, right? Different classifications. And so the intent stuff is kind of interesting there, right? All these different intents. And I'll just close out the other thing that Sami brought up, which I found equally interesting, was this shifting data estate without regard to EDW versus data lake versus lakehouse, which is trying to crawl its way back to EDW without realizing it. And the BSG, right? The bronze, silver, gold, which is data labeling around whether it's suitable for use, but gold for thee is not gold for me. And one of the current, and I think fading, thankfully, or Sami wouldn't have a company now, is this belief that the LLM is the chatbot, the whatever is just going to solve all these problems for me. because that is fundamentally built around, like when you say solving for data, garbage in, garbage out, right? Except that in this model, it's garbage in, gold out. Hey, yeah, just throw it at the AI and it'll figure everything out.
That's funny.
Yeah, really? Will it? You know, am I really putting garbage into this machine and getting gold out? It's like Back to the Future where you feed the garbage in and you get clean energy. Yeah.
Mm.
Good luck with that. And
The
so
alchemy.
we need smarter tools, right?
That's alchemy. That's
And
right.
how
Alchemy.
we get to smarter tools, we
Sure.
don't really have good answers on because we're figuring out, like, when does language tech work well? And when does language tech work poorly? And why? And what are the constraints and characteristics of where you apply these things? And Sammy is exploring a particular domain where we're going to apply these language tools to do things, but we're not going to try and make it do everything and just keep stacking crap on top. And
Right.
that's the mistake that I see through, like I think I mentioned, Y Combinator Ventures and everything OpenAI is trying to do, which is just keep stacking more stuff on there and build a framework of hope.
Framework of hope. This is fantastic. Well, folks, our first commercial break is coming up here in just a second. Do not touch that dial. We'll be right back with an absolutely fascinating conversation with Mark Matson and Sami Akbay. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, we're back here on DM Radio, a fascinating conversation. How do agentic data pipelines work? That's the big question. The guy who knows is Sami Akbay of Dagen.ai. That's Dagen.ai. Also with Mark Matson of Third Nature. And, while we were talking there, something popped into my head. I think this is really quite interesting. GDPR is the big concern, obviously. Data privacy, data sovereignty. These are huge topics these days. Well, intent. Dajan says, and Sammy says, that an agentic data pipeline must be intent aware. I think this is a fantastic thing for lots of different reasons. One, because it helps with the self healing. Two, because it helps with efficiency. These things have to be efficient. But three, because guess what? You're solving for a key component of GDPR, which is intent. Why are you doing this? And I think that the more people are forced to think through why they're doing something and to articulate why they're doing something, the better they'll realize why they're doing something and what the point of all this stuff is, right? And that why is pretty important, especially for spending money on stuff, for doing a marketing campaign. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? To understand the why is very important for humans and for machines too. But Sammy, I'll throw it over to you. What do you think?
No, I think that's actually a very critical point. When you talk about intent, it is essentially, as data engineers, the way that we fix a broken pipeline is we know why we were using this pipeline, right? Who's going to do what with it, and what's the downstream impact? When you don't know that, it's a very generic thing you could fix for the like symptom. You could remove the escaped character, or you could change the query or whatever that is because of a schema drift. But when that problem happens again, you'll have to go and do the exact same thing one more time. Instead, if we actually make the pipelines figure out and know why they exist in the first place, then they can detect the failure and repair it on its own, as long as it understands the service level commitments that it has, as long as it understands like what is the purpose that I'm doing this. Like for example, if I'm dealing with social media engagement data, right? And I have 100,000 records coming in, if I miss one, that doesn't really change the outcomes. But if I skip a record in a financial report, none of my totals are going to be accurate. If I skip one record for the digital marketing team, I don't think I'm going to lose their trust. But if I skip a few records for the controller's report, I think I'm going to lose his trust. Uh, you know, the implications of how we run these things need to be made available so that the pipelines exist or operate within their context.
Hmm.
And that's, I think, the critical thing. That's why we're defining the agentic pipeline as a data pipeline that knows why it exists, detects and repairs its own failures, and is orchestrated by AI agents, not just models, Mark, but agents, so that they can reason, act, and learn over time.
Hmm. Yeah, maybe I'll throw it over to Mark to comment. I mean, what happens with these data pipelines? It's just what happened with the ETL scripts. I remember learning this about 20 years ago when we started all this stuff, and I just kind of did the math in my head that the data warehouse gets instantiated. People hear about it, they're like, "Hey, I want my data in there." Like, okay, need another pipe, need another batch window, right? And then pretty soon it was all overnight. Then it was 24/7, all these batch windows, and it's just it takes an energy of its own. And then it's all this maintenance, and it's like, are we even really using these things? I mean, there is observability on these days. There's pretty good observability on who's using what and to what effect. But 20 years ago, you didn't have that. But still, it gets out of control, and then all of a sudden it's unwieldy. And I've heard horror stories from data engineers about how at big companies there are all these pipelines, and let me tell you, very few of them get paid attention to, and yet they're all kind of spinning and they're all burning cash, et cetera. So there's something to be said for taking a step back and being like, wait a minute, what is going on here? And oftentimes no one just has time. They're just too busy in react mode. But I don't know. What do you think, Mark? I'll throw it over to you.
Well, everybody is, well, you could say everybody's in react mode, but everybody's just doing the operations that they're doing within the architecture that has been defined.
Hmm.
And if you complain about complexity, I think one of the things you have to look at too is that like model-based, not AI model, but data model-based systems, like data warehouses and marts and, well, even machine learning models, which have a very static and tightly constrained fixed input of features, that's a data model. Those things did accumulate, right? Stuff was useful, data was useful. We started using it for more kinds of decision making. We started to take it from I'm making tactical decisions in a meeting and I have a report in front of me to active daily use, in task, on task, over process, all these different uses. That's a magnification of the complexity of use, sometimes of the same information, and sometimes you had to transform, to shift, to recalculate for a different purpose. Same data, two different transformations of data for two different purposes.
Hmm.
So what you ended up with was a simple world where the intent was populate these data models with these pipelines, and then the use is out here on the query side, right? The old world was a split of generated queries against data models and population of data models. Data lake, self-service, big data, blah, 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 threw all that out or attempted to. It didn't actually. And so then it's point to point. Every source or copy of a source in a lake fed via a pipeline to some consumption point. So I'm constraining and shifting down the needs, which makes an individual pipeline easier, but now I have 1,000 of them or 10,000 of them. And so you had a complexity of need and environment compounded by not recognizing when you should do these things and when maybe you shouldn't, compounded with decades of mergers and acquisitions and, giant constructed monopolies at this point and conglomerates. The data estate is a mirror of the complexity of the organization.
Hmm.
And so the real question is, how do you solve complexity? Well, you don't. You figure out how to adapt it. And so what is the problem? Is the problem that you can't manage really large organizations? Is the problem that you don't have the information to manage the really large organization? You phrased everything as IT problems, right? You,
Hmm.
you said, oh, this mess, there's pipelines, we're spending all this time maintaining it.
Hmm.
Yeah, because we have 1,000 times more data and 1,000 times more pipeline complexity, and we've got confounded architectures, which sometimes were mistakes and sometimes were just necessary accretions. So,
Hmm.
are you seeing the problem for what it is? Right? And that gets me back to the intent. What was the intent? Was it solve a small problem? Was it build a reusable thing? Was it investigate something we've never seen before? Each of those has a data path. And the question is, should the data path be from A source to B data model? And then the secondary path is from that to consumption. Or is this something where there is no model or the model can't deal with it and we need to actually go from A to C? That's a very different kind of a pipeline. And so we have to actually get more intelligent about those intents to guide architecture decisions, but also we don't have tools that deal with that. And I think that's something that Sami put his finger on that I think is key in tooling for the new environments.
Mm.
That was an amazing framing, by the way, Mark. I think, that is exactly the problem. The intent has evolved. The problem has gotten more complex. And what we're trying to address requires adapting rather than, just rip and replace. So the way that the early examples are, so one of the things that changed the problem, if you point an LLM or an AI application directly to a normalized schema, it does not work that well. It will have to come up with some SQL. Not every SQL is going to be the same every time it runs it. You're going to have consistency problems. You're going to introduce hallucinations. And that's why the gold layer, where you have almost like the views of that data for specific purposes, becomes pretty critical because LLMs do much better with denormalized data, tabular data that it can just look at rather than trying to do a Cartesian join in its own, context window. Which means that for each of those gold layer representations, you may want to have like a new pipeline or new representation. Yes, you have an order of magnitude more pipelines and tables or representations of that data, but at the same time, it solves or reduces the complexity. Seems like you have a bigger catalog, but at the same time, you have more purpose-specific data representations. You don't have the interdependencies that one pipeline may continue to work, the other may have to stop, right? So I think you summarize the actual problem very succinctly. The solution is, our proposal to the solution is building agentic pipelines. There might be other patterns that emerge, but the fundamental change, I think, is that now we have a different type of a data consumer with a different set of needs that is changing from traditional BI reports and dashboards that we have built.
Hmm.
I feel like that's kind of, you know, moving the problem downstream, right? Because you have a whole lot of purpose-built data products, artifacts, whatever, that are geared towards much more individual use. And so you have a lot of those, in some ways at the expense of shared meaning when, what was produced for you and what was produced for me are slightly different but use the same labels, the same terminology that has to be differentiated. But you also have this vast sort of increase in the things that are in your catalog, which now makes the problem a user problem of which thing do I need? And now we have to navigate that space. So we've solved making data and we've solved making pipelines, and so now we have a lot more of that, but now we have this other problem, which is a whole lot of stuff and trying to sort through that and figure out what stuff is needed. Or you then go back and rely on that previous environment to say, well, screw it. It's easy to make these things. I'll just make another one.
Right.
Right. And so,
And that is why building the intent into the whole picture is super critical, right?
mhm.
If you know the intent, you can also ask the system, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. We were actually, a quick example, for a demo, I ran something. I said, like, do this. And then a little later, when we were actually doing the demo, I actually tested the demo ahead of time. When we were trying to do it during the presentation, I went and said, do this. And I said, oh, we've already done that. Like, go use this particular pipeline. So the system, because it has memory and it learns, it came back and said, are you sure you want to rebuild the same pipeline again? Because you had already built this and you should use this particular flow.
Yeah, that's
Hmm.
pretty cool. And I'm
That's
reminded.
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I was going to say I'm reminded by Mark's observation here of stories I've heard about Kafka and Confluent. And Kafka is data streaming, which is fantastic for lots of reasons. One of which is you publish once and then consume wherever someone wants to. So you get one topic that gets consumed by whoever wants it. And that's great in the early days. As time passes and you get many, many, many topics and all these different threads, it becomes very difficult to manage. There are issues I've heard with Java runtime and all sorts of other things happen, but it just gets confusing is the point. And that was kind of the point I was making about all the all the batch windows. Like at a certain point, I remember asking someone in Chicago, actually, I saw you at a TDWI event, Mark, it must have been 2008, because I can kind of bracket it in my mind. And I met with these gentlemen who were rolling out some new technology. And I said, do you have the ability to sort of strategically see overall how much data is moving where and like a strategic view of your data, but de facto pipelines, we didn't call them that back then, but the ETL scripts, and they kind of laughed and said, that's a good question. And no, no, we sure don't have that, which is really important because you're moving all this stuff around. Imagine if you're running a logistics company like a freight service or something, and you don't have a strategic view of which trucks are moving products where, you would go out of business very, very quickly. But, again, these things evolve over time, and then we have to find a way to deal with the complexity. But folks, don't touch that down. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, fascinating conversation on the future of data management. I can say that confidently. I think agentic is the future, at least for many, many, many use cases. You still need people in the loop. Don't believe all this nonsense that people are going to go away. The AI is going to do it for you. No, it isn't. There was a story just today about Claude and something else just blasting someone's database, killed the production database and all the backups. And you're like, oh, well, like how, that's an error. That's not the AI's error. That is a human error. Someone did not set up that architecture properly and did not put in guardrails. And they wound up losing their entire production database. I mean, that company is dead. Like they're going to die. I can't even believe it was in the news. I'm like, why, did they pay you to admit this happened or something? Because why would you even be in the news for that? I don't even know. But self-healing is a big deal. And we've heard it before. We've heard about Larry Ellison talked about his database being self-healing. The database people I knew say, yeah, well, not really. But Sammy, I'll throw it over to you. Describe what you mean by self-healing data pipelines.
All right, so there's shades of the gray in self-healing, right? Because certain things that are relatively trivial, the system should identify and fix. Um, by the way, if you ever write code using something like Claude Code, the the whole thing that it generates is so comprehensive. I mean, I've never written code like that, right? I don't have like, I mean, exception handling that it puts in. So if you have a good bit of that built in, you're probably going to hit very few things that are human error that will cause the system to fail. But there are other reasons why these data pipelines fail, right? Your source system may have a change in its data structures. There might be some schema drift. Someone may have added or removed some columns in the source. The API definitions may have changed. You might be accepting UTF-8 data, but someone put in double byte. There's like a million reasons why the pipeline stops or there's an error. And in the previous segment, when we were talking about it, if we start creating intent specific pipelines, we're going to have probably an order of magnitude more of these pipelines. So if you understand who is going to use this, what are they going to do with it, what is the ultimate purpose of this pipeline being here, then you can also use a large language model or an agent, in our case, we call it the super agent, to figure out why did this stop? What am I ultimately trying to do? What is the best course of uh, action in this scenario? It tries to do that. If it's not within a certain confidence interval, then what does it do? It sends a Slack message or it sends an email. It's not black and white. It's not 100%. It is just trying to alleviate the, you know, simple use cases or sometimes more obvious use cases. It doesn't have to be simple, but it just has to be pretty obvious so that you don't end up with deleted databases. And by the
Yeah.
way, like that's one of the critical things. If you use agentic rather than model based, you can put the safeguards. So anytime you say just drop this table, it says I'm not allowed to.
Right. Like, do not let the kid run with scissors down the hallway. It's basically what it boils down to. Mark, I'll throw it over to you. I mean, what Sammy is describing strikes me as layers of automation, and there are simple things like the early chat bots. I think failed for a lot of different reasons, but they are good in handling the basic questions like what's the phone number, what are the hours, stuff like that. But you got to get to it quickly. I mean, like when you call phone systems and like you start, "Well, our menu options have changed. Please listen carefully." Really? Okay. And you just hang up the phone and send an email or something. But there are layers of automation, and it's useful to know the simple things to fix and fix that first and let the humans fix the more complex things. I mean, that's just the general rule with automation, right, Mark?
Yeah, except that you've just hit on the paper from the 90s by Bainbridge, which is The Perils of Automation, which says that when you do exactly that thing, you create a situation whereby the human is constantly being taxed by the machine at the machine's speed,
Right,
and you end up with a higher incidence of errors and nuclear meltdowns.
right.
And so, this is one of my three favorite topics is the whole human computer interaction, the interaction models, and the design choices that we can make around these things. Um, I think what you just described is sort of another example of human in the loop because we approach it from the perspective of the machine, and it's like we're developers, we're tech people. This is what we think the machine can do. So I'm going to automate or design for what the machine can do. And then there's a boundary, right? It's A, B, human needs to do C, D, human needs to do E, F, right? As opposed to looking at it from the perspective of the human and saying machine in the loop, right? If we want a human involved in the process,
Interesting.
what do we want the human to do, or not what do we want, but what does the human in that process want to do? And how or need to do is probably the more appropriate. And then how do we design the machine to support those things instead? Reverse that perspective so it's machine in the loop rather than human.
I love that. I gotta think on that for a while. Sammy, say something smart.
It's hard to say something smart after that comment, like, the ironies of automation. I think like what I was thinking when Mark mentioned this is
Ironies of
that
automation. Yeah.
um, since we started using AI, it doesn't feel like we're doing any less work. It feels like we're doing more work,
Right.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
number of hours I work isn't less, but at the same time, my output is also probably unprecedented. I think like in the last year and a half, I must have done more work than the preceding 10 years combined, or at
Wow.
least that's how it feels like.
Wow.
So I like the idea of machine in the loop rather than human in the loop as as an idea, but the more minutia that has to get taken care of, and machines can do that, is I think like way more than the judgment that requires real human involvement. And humans need to be on their toes. In the past, like if you did 10 hours of work, 8 hours of that could have been pretty repetitive and like did may not have required 100% concentration. Whereas now almost all the work that you do is things that require concentration because like Anything
Mm,
that doesn't require your concentration, you're just delegating it to machines and AI, and that's a big change in the pattern,
mm,
which is one of the reasons why I actually like talk about it as using technologies like Dagen actually elevates the role of a data engineer from having to do the like menial plumbing work to things that are a lot more kind of, I don't want to use the word sophisticated, but sophisticated.
hmm.
You
I'm
know,
go ahead, Mark. Go
you,
ahead.
you reminded me of, I recently dug out a paper from 1968 by Dijkstra and the title of the paper, I just looked it up, was On the Foolishness of Natural Language Programming. And it is fantastic because it talks about certain of the problems and problems of specificity and ambiguity versus what you actually need, as code, for example, which has to be very precise. And, the idea that if we do this, the theory is that we make the computer more complicated. Um, so that we have an easier time working with it. And I think that's great, right? That is an intent. That's why we use machines. And then you said, well, yeah, but it doesn't seem like I'm doing any less work, right? I haven't actually benefited from the introduction of this particular thing in the way that I would have hoped that I would have benefited, or by the way in which it was promised.
But I have created more value.
Yeah, but you've created more output. Value is always a question, right? Because I look at a lot of the big data Hadoop stuff, which was a 10-year foray into we're not creating value, but we're creating. Uh, and so, yeah, finding ways to make tools that amplify our productivity or our quality. I actually think quality is the more important of the two because quality improvements lead to productivity improvements. But Eric is waving, so I think we need to take a break here.
Yeah, we're going to break coming up here in just 15 seconds, and I have a very good analogy I'll throw at our guest as well when we come back. But send me an email if you want to be on the show, info@dmradio.biz. That comes straight to me, assuming email continues to work. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here, podcast bonus on DM Radio, talking to Sami Akbay of Dagen.ai and Mark Madsen of Third Nature, all about agentic data pipelines. And Sami, you're making a point here in the break that you have to be practical at the end of the day, especially in the data world. You must be pragmatic. Systems either work or they don't. I mean, they can work well, they can work not so well, but if they don't work at all, that's a real problem. And this agentic stuff is absolutely going to be, it's a new tax. It's a new tax on old infrastructure. It's like a much faster engine in a old chassis that you're going to have trouble. I mean, if you have a very powerful engine in a weak chassis, that car is going to break. And so I think the data infrastructure is going to collapse under the weight of this agentic demand unless we solve for that problem. And that's your vision of Dagen AI and of again using the skills and the agents to to administer your guardrails because you can't use the model to do that. Don't trust the model to do things it can't do. Use these skills and the agents for your guardrails and for your execution for deterministic results, right, Sammy?
And memory and a few other things. But I agree with you. And I want to say that, like, I don't like fear mongering. I don't want to say, like, things are going to fail or anything like that. It's just we have to stay current with the things, the new direction, and the new demands from the data estate.
Hmm.
And using an agentic framework in order to do that is probably going to help us elevate our game. It's going to be how data engineers or analytic engineers will need to evolve because let's just be honest, our work is not going to get easier over the next few years or the foreseeable future. It's just going to be more and more, and we'll have to be more productive, more efficient, and the way to do that is by using the tools that have been made available to our partners in crime on the development side, the people who are building the applications, the people who are going to need the data that we have been nurturing. And I strongly believe that, like, we have to use agentic data pipelines for the next generation of the applications that we need to power as data professionals.
Hmm. Well, you need some way to manage the data flow, but you bring up an excellent point, and I'll throw it over to Mark for some closing comments here. But you're with the data, you're catering to the application developers and you're catering to the business people. So all the business people, it's still, and I love that machine in the loop, by the way. But at the end of the day, it's still people doing things, and people need to monitor things, and people need to be accountable for things. You can't take an agent to court. I mean, we've kind of seen some of that with the autonomous driving stuff, and I don't think it's so complicated to drive a car. I'm not a big fan of the automated car driving stuff or the Waymos where they leave the door open and then the Waymo is useless until a DoorDash driver comes by and closes it for them. I mean, there are all kind of problems that come about. But at the end of the day, the data infrastructure must serve the agents and it must serve the people, the business users. And I think that's why this vision is pretty profound. But Mark, I'll throw over to you. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with Sammy. I don't think that the current architecture is, going to collapse because it's already collapsing. Um, the amplification of so-called self-service, which turns out to just be, backlog from the previous environment that didn't get done half the time, at least in my experience. Um, that just we've now got maybe some different tools that take care of that backlog. And, now we have an increased maintenance burden, right? But we have an increased staff and nothing that we have increased productivity. The so-called modern data stack and manually coded Python and SQL and DBT with Airflow running in Kubernetes, which none of which had built-in metadata for a long time and still doesn't have very good metadata, and on and on and on, means we made the environment even more technically complicated, which took more operations, and we actually made things worse. And so, it's already kind of a mess. So making bits and pieces of that at least easier to manage, more productive, is going to help us dig out because there is no rip and replace for this. You don't pause your business for 12 months while you rip and replace whole sections of this
Right.
stuff. You have to keep working. People have jobs to do, and then that's hard because you're trying to do these new things to clean up the mess, right? That's why traffic, street work takes so long because you got to keep the traffic flowing while you're working. And sometimes you do it at night, and sometimes you got to restrict the traffic, and
Mhm.
people don't like that. And so we've got a whole lot of that happening. I think that there are with code generation a whole lot of potential things to do here. And one of the things I like about the pipeline stuff is that currently hacking pipeline code toolless in Python and SQL is a thankless, painful programming task for which generators are actually pretty capable. And putting them into a framework that does some things that Sammy showed at the demo at the start, like, well, if it's generating the code, it can also generate the metadata and it can generate these bits of lineage and it can generate these other things and stash them all away, which in the current regime are manual tasks or post hoc environment and code scanning tasks in other tools.
Or
Right. And
tribal
so
knowledge.
this is a good solution or approach to a solution to dig us out of the hole that we dug ourselves into.
Yeah, or tribal knowledge that lives in the heads of like, the few really smart people we have in all of our organizations, right?
Yeah.
We need to,
Tribal knowledge is a big one.
yeah.
Yeah. And the intent, the intention. I'll get back to being intent aware. And I'll just kind of close with this, folks. I think we had a show a couple of weeks ago where one of the guests made an excellent point. He goes, I think we're seeing an inflection point that was trying to happen for like the last 20 to 30 years. And I think that is true. I think to my point earlier about asking the question 20 years ago, hey, do you have a strategic view of where it is? Like, no, we don't. I mean, can you imagine running like a commuter train system where you don't know where it's all going? Come on, you can't even do that. It would be impossible because you only have one set of tracks, right? But when you think about the need to finally get our heads around what's going where, Well, that time has come, and you always need some marshaling area in which to do that to be able to keep feeding. Like Mark said, the traffic's going to keep going, so you got to keep the data going to the users, to the agents, et cetera, while you're trying to fix this thing. And so that is why you want a marshaling area to do that. And it sounds to me like Sami Akbay with Dagen.ai is on the right path to get that done. Well, like I've said, send me an email if you want to be in the show, info@dmradio.biz. You have been listening to DM Radio.